So today I'm going to be showing you a watercolour painting of a little heron on a river. One of the things you'll sort of notice about this is it's got a very sort of misty vibe to it. It's nice and kind of atmospheric. The reason why I actually did this painting is so I could try a technique that a friend of mine was talking about, a fellow artist, of putting a final wash over a finished piece to create a sort of vignette and a kind of misty atmosphere. Now it was partially successful, and I wasn't 100% sure I was going to actually show you guys this video because it was only partially successful, but as I've done recently in a couple of my other videos that I've been sort of hanging around and I've not really been sure whether I'm going to use them or not. So anyway, enough of my guff, let's crack on with this beast. So what we're doing here is I'm using a black fine liner, a 0.5 here. I wanted some thin lines, some light lines, apart from where the heron is, where I wanted the heron to stand out. There's the kind of focal point really of the piece. So I'm sketching in a few boundaries really. This river scene is a very atmospheric scene. It's got a lot of mist and kind of sort of autumnal vibes, or maybe it's early morning or early evening. You can decide. But it certainly is a beautiful scene on a muddy estuary. And I've maybe mentioned before that I occasionally do some sailing on the south coast of England, in Cornwall, on some of the muddy estuaries there, and this scene is a very familiar and pleasing scene. It just reminds me of being on the boat and getting cozy and maybe having a little whiskey. So this is the beginning of the painting process, and because it's going to start as a sort of wet in wet process, the first thing I want to do is ensure I've got a good covering of water on the paper. So there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can either do it by just covering it with a big brush a couple of times and then giving it a sort of 30 seconds or to a minute just to sink in. Or the other way you can do it is you can get a little spray bottle like I'm using here. You can buy these off like Amazon and eBay for like 5 of them for a couple of quid. And one of the things I want to try and keep in this drawing is this sort of sense of warmth in the middle, this focal point around the heron. So I'm adding in some natural sienna around the heron there and a little bit of the quinacridone gold in the foreground, and then using some of this quinacridone rose colour here and creating a kind of a little bit of a gradient washing effect. So after I've done this first part of the process, I've let it dry slightly, and then I've gone back in with a thinner brush here and some of this Van Dyck brown, and I'm adding in some of the areas in the background, the sort of what I would say was like trees in the mist, if you know what I mean. Now I use Van Dyck brown a lot in my art. I wouldn't have black on the palette, but I think Van Dyck brown works particularly well as a kind of blackish simulacrum, but also I find mixed with French ultramarine and cobalt, it gives you beautiful greys. So this gets a hair dry now. So if you actually had a piece of paper and you completely wet it and you made some marks, you could probably, depending on how dry your environment is or how warm your house is, you can probably continue working it for sort of 20-25 minutes really until it's completely dry, maybe even longer. And obviously the proportion of wetness on the paper will dictate how soft those marks become when you apply the paint. So here I'm adding in some of this detail in the foreground for this mud flat here. I'm using a slightly dry brush type technique because it has got some reflection on it. It's a bit of a sort of broken surface. Now tissue paper I use a lot in my art, particularly in watercolour, because I like to be bold with my marks, and I'll sometimes put something in straight away. No, that's too much, and you can just dab it out with tissue paper. Now watercolour is can be a staining media, so some paint is going to stain more than others, so you have to just be a bit mindful of that. And then the heron is going to get a little bit of a paint in here. Now I've done the outline of that in fine liner because I really wanted it to be crisp. Now if you're beginning your art journey, or you've been painting for a while but you don't have a lot of confidence, I would say that looking at these kind of paintings can feel a bit intimidating. Now when I think, when I hadn't touched watercolour up to about maybe 10 years ago, and I used to watch tutorials like this to think, I'll never be able to do that. Or, I would think, well, why would you do that? Which is one of the reasons I got attracted to, line and wash work and urban sketching, is because it had a certain beauty in its speed, and it felt like I could do 4 different sketches in the time that I could, do one watercolour. But all that said, I really would encourage you to try and do a detailed study in any media, because I feel that it's a really good way of just improving your technique in that one thing. It feels like a bit of a specialisation sometimes, just in one area can be quite revealing. So we're going to dry that off again. We're going to hair dry that one more time. So next stage is here to apply the foreground. Now you can. So if you see the way that I'm applying this brush is I'm putting the tip down and then pushing down onto the brush and then lifting off slowly, and that's how you get these marks. And one of the things that I quite enjoy doing with YouTube particularly is checking out different painters. Now there's a lot of really good floral painters on YouTube, and they use brushes in really interesting ways, cat's paws and all sorts of weird and wonderful brushes to create some really quite beautiful effects. So here I'm using a thin brush and I'm adding in literally that, some sage, and some of this I've sketched in beforehand, as you saw with the fine line, but a lot of it is looking at the reference drawing and kind of busking it a little bit, really. You can see I'm using some tissue there just to dab out some bits that I wasn't pleased with. Too thick a line, I think it was. So we're going to just add in a lot of detail in the foreground there, some sedges, and I might just sort of fast forward through some of those elements because you don't really need to see them all. And then that's going to get a hair dry again. And the reason why I've gone a hair dried that halfway through the grass on the right hand side is just because I didn't really want to be smearing it, So the next stage here is to have a look at that left hand side. Now again, I'm using a slightly different brush here again. This is a rigger brush, which rigger brushes are R-I-G-G-E-R, named because they were, I think used for or developed for doing things like rigging on ships. So really good for doing long lines. So really this piece is looking quite nice, and I think it's got a kind of vibe about it that's quite pleasing. I think the contrast between the quite hard lines in the foreground and the lines in the background, softness in the background, work quite well. Yeah, it's nice. So moving on, we'll fast forward to doing some of the sedge leaves. Again, I'm using a similar technique to do some more droopy leaves on the left hand side here with I think that's like a transparent red oxide I'm using there, that paint. So I'm mixing in a bit of Daniel Smith undersea green here, a little bit of sap green and a little bit of blue, and just creating some of those grass colours. And again, I'm adding in some grass areas on the right hand side as well there. So one of the last bits of detail I'm doing here is I'm just putting a few dots in. Now I think these spatters sometimes read as detail. They're non-specific detail. And, also in things like reeds, you will get little boluses of fibres and stuff like that. So again, we're going to have a hair dry of that for the last time. So here I've decided just to add in a tiny little bit more of the fine liner on the heron. And then we come to the last stage of the painting. Now, I don't know how you feel about it, but I think the painting looks good there. And, you could argue that, well, just leave it there, don't do anything else. But the reason why I wanted to show you this technique is because it is a wonderful technique, but it comes with a caveat. And if you do it well, it can be really, really effective. But there's certain things you have to be really, really careful with. So this technique is when so I know I'm building this up, but it's So the last stage of this drawing is to put a wash over the top of it all. Over the top, the whole of the picture. Now what I'm choosing to do here is a gradient wash of a couple of different colours, but effectively I want to create a vignette, a kind of dark area all the way around the outside with a highlight on the bird. Now, so one of the most important things when you're doing this technique is you really want to spray on water and make sure you get a covering after the piece is completely dry. So the first thing you do is completely dry the piece. Leave it a day ideally, or use a hairdryer, but make sure it's absolutely bone dry. That's really important. Clean water, and then when you apply the water on top, as I'm doing here, don't use a brush. Use a spray bottle and spray on top of there. Now I made a couple of mistakes here. I didn't really let it dry 100%, which probably was silly. But the big mistake I made is when I started to apply the paint here, You see they're the really super light touches I'm using here. This is what you need. Really light touches. Don't move the brush backwards and forwards, because you're going to reactivate the paint and it's all going to turn into a big mushy horrible mess. So I think I'm doing okay at this point. I think where I come a cropper is the bottom right hand corner. Now you can see also when I sprayed the paint on, it's picked up here in the bottom left hand corner. It's picked up that orange. Now that shouldn't have reactivated quite as quickly as that, but it doesn't matter, we're going to continue. Now the sort of effect of this is a bit rainbow, but don't worry too much about that. You know, the idea is we want to create some sort of atmosphere. It looks quite nice there. Okay, so I'm going to get a bit of tissue here and I'm just going to pull out a little bit in the center around the heron, because I really want that to have a nice colour pop to it. I think I've pulled out a bit too much, so I'm just adding a tiny bit of backing. Alright, so we're going to hair dry that at that point. So one of the last things I'm doing here is I'm taking off the masking tape in the dramatic unveiling. So once this is, you know, fully dried and the masking tape's off, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, it didn't quite work out. So what's happened is, because I didn't let it fully dry, and because I probably, when I applied the water in those bottom corners, I moved the brush around a bit too much. And you really have to be super careful that you don't move the brush backwards and forwards loads, because it will reactivate the paint, obviously, and then it starts to go all soft. But I quite like it, you know, I do quite like the sort of vibe of it. It looks almost like sort of out of focus. But what I've decided to do is to try and reinstate a little bit of the detail using the pen. And again, I'm not sure that was the right decision. You know, I actually think if I just gone and put some focus directly on the bird, you know, made the bird super sharp and left all this in the background slightly blurred, it would have given you that sort of shallow depth of field, you know, like sort of lens blur almost. So actually I think it could have been left. I don't think it really needed this bit, but you know, you live and learn. So I'll just add a little bit more paint on the bird as well, just to darken that down a tiny bit. So yeah, that was a really interesting process. Let's go and have a look at the finished version. So here I'm looking at the finished version. So in conclusion then, ladles and jelly spoons, I think this is a good technique. You know, I think it's got a lot of applications. It's a really useful way of putting in a atmosphere and a sort of feel to a picture after you've done the picture, if you know what I mean. I mean, initially you could put a wash in first here, and I think that's the safer way of doing it, you know, putting a wash in right at the beginning to create that vignette, and then putting in the details in afterwards, to me seems a bit more logical. But there's nothing to say that if you've done a drawing and it feels like it's flat or it's lacking something, you can't go and put it in afterwards. But as I say, you have to be quick, you have to be careful, and you have to make sure that you don't work the paper too much, because you'll lose a lot of that detail. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you enjoyed me modelling, doing stuff, and not going, wow, this is great, but actually going, I'm not sure, maybe I'll have a bit more play, you know, maybe I'll come back to this one, because that's the point, isn't it? And hopefully a long time to play, explore, and just enjoy the journey. So thank you for joining me on this one. Do let me know in the comments, please, what you think of this. It'd be really nice to have some feedback on this one. And as always, thank you for looking at these. If you're on YouTube, if you want to see some longer stuff, head over to my Patreon channel, where for a few bucks you can see longer videos. And I want to thank my patrons for all the support. You guys really keep the lights on. And if you also want to become a member of the channel here, you can see some longer, more exclusive membership content on there. Anyway, I'm gibbering. Get yourself a cup of tea, put some music on, go do some art. You've been told. Alright, see you guys later. Bye bye.